In the winter of 1948, a small town in central Idaho was facing a problem that most people would consider unsolvable. The landscape was eroding. Streams were drying up. The land itself was becoming something it had never been before, barren. And the solution that officials eventually settled on would become one of the most unusual conservation efforts in American history. They decided to drop beavers out of an airplane. This is not a story about government waste or misguided bureaucrats. This is a story about one of the most elegant and cost-effective solutions ever devised for a land management problem. And it reveals something profound about how nature actually heals itself when given the tools it needs. It is also the story of how the cheapest fix often turns out to be the most expensive in the long run when you fail to apply it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is where you are. Before we go any further, I need to pause for a second. This story is about the relationship between landscape management and cost. What Idaho officials discovered was that the problem wasn't expensive to solve once they understood what created it. The solution was already in the landscape, they just had to reintroduce it. When we talk about low-cost living, we're talking about how to live in alignment with natural systems, how to build resilience without building debt, and achieve abundance by understanding how systems work. The Beaver Project contains all these lessons compressed into one extraordinary moment in time. The story begins in the high mountain valleys of central Idaho, in a region called the Chalice area. The landscape there is harsh but beautiful. Long winters, short summers, and terrain that rises from 5,000 to 10,000 feet elevation. It is the kind of place where every system has to be efficient or it collapses. The water systems especially. In a mountain valley, if the streams dry up, everything else fails. The soil becomes brittle. Vegetation can't take root. Erosion accelerates. And once erosion begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. The more soil you lose, the more water runs off in floods instead of soaking in, which means less water underground for the dry months, which means less vegetation can grow to hold the soil together. It's a descending spiral. By the late 1940s, the effects were visible to anyone who read the landscape. Streams ran low in summer when they should have flowed steadily. Meadows were turning to sagebrush steppe. The water table was dropping. Springs that had flowed year-round were starting to run dry. Erosion was visible in every gully and stream bank, where soil washed away faster than vegetation could hold it in place. By the 1940s, the Chalice area was in the grip of this spiral. The streams were not thriving. The meadows were not recovering after the dry season, and the land was eroding at an accelerating rate. The people of the region understood that something had to change, but the scale of the problem seemed to exceed the scale of solutions anyone could afford. What nobody in Chalice was thinking about in 1947 was beavers. Beavers had been trapped and hunted out of the region decades earlier. In the 1800s, during the fur trade era, beavers had been so plentiful that professional trappers could make a living removing them. Beavers were valuable. Their pelts were in demand in Europe and the eastern United States. By the early 1900s, however, the beaver population of the entire West had been reduced to a fraction of what it had been before European contact. In some mountain regions, beavers had been completely eliminated. The ecological consequence of removing beavers from a watershed was not well understood at the time, but the physical consequence was obvious to anyone who looked at the landscape. Without beavers, streams had a different shape. The water ran faster. It didn't pool. There were no wetlands. The aquifer didn't recharge properly. Vegetation that depended on consistent water availability died back, and once that vegetation died, the erosion accelerated. A stream without beavers is a system optimized for transport. Water flows rapidly downhill, carrying sediment with it. The sediment that makes up the productive soil of meadows is washed away. The water that would normally soak into the ground is funneled downstream. The result is a landscape that becomes drier and more erodible with each passing year. It's a system in decline, and the decline accelerates because each loss creates conditions for the next loss. The beaver, when it exists in a system, reverses this dynamic completely. The man who understood this connection was Elmer Ferris, a biologist working for what was then called the Bureau of Fish and Game in Idaho. Ferris had been watching the condition of the Challis area decline for years. He had studied beaver ecology in other parts of the West, in places where beavers still existed in moderate numbers. He knew that beavers didn't just live in streams. Beavers engineered streams. They built dams. Those dams slowed water. They created pools. They allowed water to sink into the ground. They reduced flooding and erosion. They created habitat for fish, birds, and vegetation. And they did all of this work for free. Ferris had studied conventional land management thinking, which assumed that landscape problems were solved with structures, dams, irrigation canals, terraces. You engineered a solution. You imposed a human design on the land. But he had also observed places where beavers were still abundant. Those places looked profoundly different. The streams, meadows, and water tables were all different. Forests were different. Wildlife was different. Ferris drew a radical conclusion. What if the answer to the Challis problem was not to build something new, but to restore something old? The question Ferris asked was deceptively simple but revolutionary for its time. If we're losing the landscape because we removed the beavers from it, what if we put them back? What if the solution to our landscape problem was literally that straightforward? The practical challenge was that there were no beavers left in the Challis area. Beavers existed elsewhere in Idaho, in regions where they had been protected from trapping. The state could capture beavers from those regions and relocate them. But the Challis area was remote. It was not connected to roads in the way it is today. And capturing 76 beavers and moving them by truck over mountain passes seemed like an enormous undertaking. The cost would be high. The logistics would be nightmarish. The failure rate might be terrible. And then someone asked a question that changed everything. What if we dropped them out of an airplane? To modern ears, this sounds reckless. Beavers are not birds. They don't have wings. Dropping them from an airplane seemed like a formula for killing them all. But Ferris and the team from Idaho Fish and Game believed they could make it work. They designed special boxes. The boxes were made of wood, heavily padded with straw. They were designed to land in water. The streams and ponds and lakes of the remote mountain valleys were the target. The beavers would land in the boxes, in water. The boxes would float. The beavers would be able to escape. And in theory, the beavers would take it from there. The operation was planned for the summer of 1948. Early summer was chosen because it gave the beavers time to build their dams and gather food before the long mountain winter. The airplane was a Douglas A-26 Invader, a military aircraft from the recent war that had been repurposed for civilian use. It was not a natural choice for dropping cargo into valleys, but it was what was available and what the state could afford. The A-26 was a fast, maneuverable aircraft that could operate from rough airstrips. It had a large cargo capacity, and crucially, it could fly low and slow enough to conduct the delicate operation of dropping live animals into remote mountain terrain. The logistics were extraordinary. The team scouted valleys by hand to identify landing zones, water stretches large enough to absorb impact and isolated from humans. They calculated velocity and trajectory in mountain conditions, predicted wind patterns, and accounted for thin mountain air. With 1,948 technology and no computers, they relied on instinct, experience, and paper calculations the way engineers had worked for centuries. The first few drops were test runs. They dropped empty boxes, then boxes with sandbags. They adjusted their techniques based on what they observed. Some boxes tumbled too much. The team redesigned them with better weight distribution. Some boxes overshot the landing zones. The team calculated new drop points. Other boxes came in too hard. The team added more padding. It was a process of iteration and improvement, conducted in real time at elevation in mountains. And then, in the summer of 1948, they were ready. The aircraft took off from a small airfield. It climbed toward the high mountain valleys of central Idaho. The pilots had coordinates for specific lakes and stream stretches. The team loaded the first batch of beavers into the padded boxes. The beavers, sensing that something unusual was about to happen, made their characteristic tail-slapping sounds, which can be startlingly loud in a small aircraft. And then, at the right moment, at the right altitude, above the right stretch of water, the boxes were released. 76 beavers in total were dropped into the Chalice area over the course of that summer. Multiple trips were required. Each trip could carry a certain number of boxes. The aircraft would climb, the boxes would be released, and the team would watch through binoculars to see if the beavers made it out safely. Some drops were precise. The boxes landed in water, and the beavers swam free immediately, shaking themselves off and disappearing into the creek. Other drops were less precise. Some boxes landed on land, and the beavers had to escape from the boxes and find their way to water. The beavers proved to be resourceful and resilient. Even when a box landed on dry ground, the beaver could chew through the wood and escape without injury. Even when released far from the nearest stream, the beaver could find water. But astonishingly, almost all of them made it. The project worked. No one expected it to work so well. Over the following months and years, ecological transformation began. The beavers built dams from stones, mud, and branches from willows and cottonwoods. The dams slowed water, which pooled and deepened. Soil that had been drying began to stay moist. Groundwater that had been declining began to stabilize. Vegetation returned willows, cottonwoods, sedges that depend on moisture. The meadows began to recover. The streams, which had been roaring fast, began to meander. They held water in pools instead of rushing it away. They became streams where fish could live, where birds could hunt, where the entire ecosystem could rebuild itself. Moose, which had been absent, began to return. Muskrats appeared, minks, otters. The species list of birds expanded significantly. It wasn't a complete ecological restoration. 76 beavers working over a few years can only accomplish so much. But it was a reversal of the downward trend. It was genuine healing. The cost of the project was approximately $75 per beaver. In 1948 dollars, this was a modest expense. The state had paid for the aircraft time, the special boxes, the labor of the biologists and technicians. When you divided the total cost by 76 beavers, the per-unit cost was negligible, and the benefit was incalculable. The Chalice area was transformed. The streams recovered. The meadows recovered. The erosion slowed and eventually reversed. Fish populations recovered. Wildlife populations that depended on the wetland habitat recovered. The landscape became healthier, more resilient, and more productive. All because 76 beavers had been dropped from an airplane. The project became famous, at least among biologists and land managers. Elmer Ferris and the Idaho Fish and Game team had demonstrated something that had never been proven before with such clarity and scale. They had shown that a simple biological intervention, done at modest cost, could trigger an ecological cascade that would heal a landscape for decades. They had shown that you didn't need massive engineering projects or government programs or expensive infrastructure. You needed to understand the system. You needed to identify what was missing, and you needed to reintroduce it. Other states began to ask questions. Could this work in other places? The answer, it turned out, was yes. Over the following decades, beavers were reintroduced into dozens of mountain valleys across the West. Some of these reintroductions used aircraft, like the Idaho project. Others used trucks or boats. But the principle was the same. Put the engineers back in the landscape, and the landscape will heal itself. The low-cost living lesson becomes clear when you consider the alternative. If Idaho officials had rejected the Beaver project as too risky, they would have built concrete dams instead. Human dams, built with heavy equipment, hundreds or thousands of labor hours, and materials brought in at great expense from outside the region, and they would have accomplished a fraction of what the beavers accomplished. A single concrete dam costs millions of dollars to build and maintain. A single dam, the entire Idaho project, with 76 beavers and an airplane and special boxes, and months of planning and engineering, was accomplished for less than $6,000 in 1948 money. And yet, the beaver dams that resulted were far more effective than concrete could ever be. They were more adaptable. They required no maintenance. They lasted for decades without supervision. They didn't need to be repaired by crews of human workers working on schedules. The beavers maintained them automatically, and when a beaver dam was breached in a flood, the beaver built it back up. The system was self-maintaining indefinitely. This is the pattern that runs through the entire story and threads through human history. The cheapest solution to a landscape problem is usually the solution that works with natural systems instead of against them. It's the solution that amplifies natural processes instead of trying to replace them with human engineering. It's the solution that restores a missing component of an ecosystem instead of trying to engineer a substitute for what evolution spent millions of years perfecting. The thing is, this is not a new insight. Traditional ecological knowledge, the knowledge developed by indigenous peoples over thousands of years, is full of examples of this principle. Indigenous fire management in California and the Southwest used controlled burns to prevent catastrophic wildfires. The principle was simple and elegant. Controlled burns cost almost nothing. You use fire that's already present in the landscape. You don't import energy or technology. You work with the system that's already there, guiding it rather than replacing it. Indigenous water management systems used terraces and runoff management with no electricity, pumps, or complicated technology. A terrace system maintains itself. Water and soil follow the same paths year after year with no maintenance cost. The Hohokam built canal systems that lasted for centuries, using hand tools and human labor. Some are still visible today. They worked because they worked with natural systems instead of against them. The difference is that by the time Elmer Ferris was thinking about beavers in 1948, the European knowledge tradition had been the dominant one in the West for more than a century. The tradition of engineering, of building concrete dams and irrigation canals and replacing natural systems with human-designed systems, was the assumption that underlay all land management. It was expensive, but it was what was done. The idea that you might solve a landscape problem by restoring a missing animal was not part of that tradition. But Ferris had studied the landscape carefully over years of observation. He had observed what happened in places where beavers still existed. He had seen the striking difference they made, and he had had the intellectual courage to propose a solution that directly contradicted the dominant engineering paradigm. Instead of building something new, he did something simpler. He removed something that shouldn't have been removed in the first place. He restored what was supposed to be there. This is where the story becomes relevant to the question of cost. The immediate cost of reintroducing beavers was low, but the cost of not reintroducing them, the cost of allowing the landscape to continue degrading, the cost of building expensive concrete dams to try to compensate for the missing beavers, the cost of dealing with erosion and reduced water availability would have been enormous. The deferred cost of the failure to restore the ecosystem would have exceeded the immediate cost of the restoration many times over. The Beaver project in Chalice succeeded because Ferris understood this. He understood that the cheap solution was not a shortcut. It was the correct solution. It was the solution that addressed the root cause instead of treating symptoms. It was the solution that worked with natural systems instead of against them. Over the following decades, the reintroduction of beavers in Idaho and other western states became increasingly popular. Ranchers who initially objected, worried that beavers would dam irrigation ditches, eventually discovered that beaver dams often improved water availability, especially during droughts. The beaver ponds acted as natural reservoirs, storing water, reducing flooding, and recharging the aquifer. Initial resistance dissolved when the data became undeniable. A rancher facing a dry stream in a drought year is motivated to find solutions. If beavers create water storage, objections become secondary. The immediate need water overrides longer-term worries. Over time, when the rancher sees the water persisting, the ecosystem healthier, and wildlife returning, objections fade entirely. The rancher becomes an advocate. Fishermen discovered that beaver ponds created superior habitat for trout and other native fish. Native fish populations recovered substantially. Sport fishing opportunities improved dramatically. Hunters discovered that beaver ponds attracted elk and deer and other game animals seeking water and food. Wildlife numbers increased across the ecosystem. The system was becoming richer, not poorer. The science of this had been working in the background the entire time. Beaver dams don't just slow water, they fundamentally change the entire hydrological cycle of a stream system. They reduce the velocity of water flow dramatically. This allows sediment to drop out of suspension. The sediment, which would otherwise wash downstream and be lost forever, is trapped behind the dam. It builds up as a terrace of rich, fertile soil. The water, instead of running fast and cold, sits in pools where it warms up. Aquatic plants grow. Aquatic insects thrive. Fish populations recover. The entire food web of the stream system becomes more complex and more robust. A stream running fast through a valley loses water. A dammed stream holds water in pools, raising the water table. Soil stays moist. Vegetation survives and holds soil together. Erosion decreases. The change is self-reinforcing in the positive direction. More vegetation holds more soil. Stable banks keep water in the system longer. More infiltration means higher water table, which means more moisture for vegetation. The system enters an upward spiral, a positive feedback loop. Without beavers, the system spirals downward. No dams, fast flow, erosion, vegetation loss, lower water table, more erosion. Understanding this is key to understanding why reintroduction is so powerful. The Chalice Valley, 70 years after the beaver drop, looks substantially different from the way it looked in 1948. The streams are healthy and flowing consistently. The meadows are productive and lush. The ecosystem is robust and biodiverse. And all of this happened with no ongoing maintenance, with no ongoing cost, with just that initial 76 beaver intervention and the continuous biological labor of the beavers and their descendants. This is the core of what we mean by low-cost living in a landscape context. It's not necessarily about having less. It's about understanding the systems that are already in place, working with them, and leveraging small inputs to create large outputs. It's about restoration instead of replacement. It's about biological solutions instead of engineering solutions when the context allows for it. There are a few caveats, of course. Beavers are not a universal solution to every land management problem. In some places, beaver dams do create complications. They can dam up irrigation ditches and reduce water availability to farmers downstream. They can fell trees that people want to keep standing. They can create swamps in places where people want to maintain open meadows. The point is not that beavers are always good. The point is that understanding the role of beavers in a landscape, understanding what problems their absence creates and what problems their presence might create, is absolutely essential to making wise decisions about land management. The broader principle is that the cheapest and most effective solutions to landscape problems often come from understanding and working with existing ecological relationships instead of trying to replace them with human engineering. When you have the choice between building something expensive and restoring something that's missing, restoration is usually both cheaper and more effective. This principle has been demonstrated and borne out again and again in the decades since the Chalice Beaver project. Beavers have been reintroduced to hundreds of stream systems in the West. In nearly every single case, the results have been consistently positive. Erosion has decreased measurably. Water availability has improved noticeably, especially during drought years. Fish populations have recovered. Wildlife populations have increased dramatically, and the cost has remained remarkably low relative to engineering alternatives. Other animals have been reintroduced for similar purposes with striking results. Wolves in the northern Rockies have reshaped the landscape by changing how elk herds move and browse. The presence of wolves has allowed vegetation to recover in areas that had been heavily browsed. In some places, this has been controversial, but the ecological effects have been exactly as predicted by researchers. The landscape has become healthier and more resilient. Bison are being reintroduced to grasslands in the Great Plains for similar reasons. Bison are ecological engineers in the truest sense. They shape the landscape through their grazing patterns. They create mosaic patterns of vegetation diversity. They reduce fire risk by preventing grasslands from becoming dense and uniform. They improve soil health through their grazing, trampling, and nutrient contributions. And they do all of this work without any ongoing human cost or maintenance. Controlled burning is being reintroduced to the management of forests and grasslands across the continent after decades of suppression. Fire is an ecological engineer in the deepest sense. It has shaped the landscapes of North America for thousands of years as part of natural management cycles. The suppression of fire, the attempt to eliminate fire entirely from fire-adapted ecosystems, has been one of the most expensive and least effective land management strategies in the entire history of the United States. It has created conditions for catastrophic wildfires. It has eliminated biological diversity. It has led to forests of uniform age and species composition, vulnerable to pest and disease. Now that fire suppression is being abandoned in favor of carefully managed controlled burning, the costs are going down, and the ecological outcomes are improving measurably. The pattern is consistent. When you work with natural systems, costs decrease and effectiveness increases. When you work against natural systems, costs increase, and you have to keep investing more and more just to maintain what you've achieved. The Chalice Beaver project was significant not because it was the first reintroduction. There had been other reintroductions before in other places. It was significant because it demonstrated a principle that was not widely accepted at the time, and is still not universally accepted today. It demonstrated that you could solve a major landscape problem with a small, cheap intervention if you understood the system correctly. It demonstrated conclusively that restoration was possible. It demonstrated that you didn't need unlimited resources and unlimited engineering and unlimited technological sophistication to heal a damaged landscape. Sometimes the answer is simpler than that. 76 beavers and a modified airplane, and about $6,000, changed the hydrology of an entire valley system for the next 7 decades and counting. That's approximately $85 per year per stream mile of recovery. That's the kind of cost efficiency that no engineering project can match. That's the kind of return on investment that makes financial analysts weep with envy. The relevance to low-cost living is profound and practical at once. If you understand the systems that sustain your land and your water and your habitat, you can often find solutions that are radically cheaper than the alternatives. You can work with nature instead of against it. You can invest in restoration instead of replacement. You can put back what's missing instead of trying to engineer a substitute that will never be as effective or self-maintaining as what nature provides. The beavers of Chalice are still there, 76 years later. Well, not the same ones. Beavers live about 15 years in the wild, but their descendants are there, generation after generation. The dams are still being built and maintained without human intervention. The streams are still being engineered with perfect precision. The valleys are still being healed by the labor of creatures who ask nothing but aspen bark and mud. And the cost of all of this work is borne entirely by the beavers themselves. There's a lesson in that for anyone who's trying to solve a problem on a budget. The lesson is simple. Understand the system. Find what's missing. Restore what should be there. The cheapest solution is almost always the one that works with nature instead of against it. And the most effective solution is almost always the same one. If you're watching this, you're already thinking about these problems. You're thinking about how to build a life and maintain a landscape and manage resources on a budget that doesn't break you. Maybe you're thinking about your own land, the streams that run through it, the soil it's built on. Maybe you're thinking about the broader questions of how we live on this planet and what kind of economy we want to build. Either way, the Beaver Project offers a simple and elegant answer to all of these questions. Don't try to engineer your way out of every problem. Sometimes the answer is to restore what was supposed to be there in the first place. Sometimes the solution is that simple.